Oh, we've covered low quality solar, which again can offset electrical use. We talked about heliostats, which frankly are just massively large installations in the desert. Super cool, like I mentioned, my favorite. But the one type of solar that you're probably most familiar with is the concept of photovoltaic. And this is using electricity or using solar radiation to directly generate electricity rather than spinning the magnets. So this is really the first time we've seen electricity generated by not spinning a magnet. And so a photovoltaic system uses what we call solar cells, which are made out of silicone, which is a metal, and it is what we would call a semiconductor. Now, a semiconductor meaning that it can conduct electricity, but not super effectively. Just slow enough that we can actually take advantage of it in this concept, right? So something like a copper wire would just be a conductor, but silicone, kind of a lesser known metal, would be considered a semiconductor. And so the way that this works is, if I were to draw in cross-section, so a solar cell kind of looks like a layer cake, but it's a few very specific ingredients. So it has what we would call N-type silicone. So again, silicone being a semiconductor. There's another layer which is pretty important, and that's what we call P-type. So there's two types of silicone, N-type and P-type. There's basically a layer in between that separates those two. It's what's called the depletion layer. So the depletion layer keeps the two different types of silicone separated. And then there's always some sort of backer, right, which is just structural. It holds the whole thing together so it doesn't break. So, some backing material, structural support. It can be lots of different things. And so this is, again, a cross-section of a standard photovoltaic cell, but it still doesn't explain how this all works. But to set the stage, we have one type of silicone here, which, if prompted by solar radiation, will start to give up electrons. And there's another type of silicone here, which is hungry for electrons. And so we'll kind of see how this all works. We'll erase some of this stuff, and we'll put our sun in there. So when our solar radiation comes blasting in, essentially what it does is it dislodges electrons in our N-type silicone, right? Our semiconductor. So now we have a bunch of free electrons. I'm going to show those with a blue marker here, way larger than regular electrons. But now we have a few extra electrons sitting here without anywhere to go. And then down here in the P-type, there are electron holes. So I'm going to draw those blue open circles. This is a layer of silicon that actually is devoid. It's low on electrons. And so if we connect all of this essentially with one wire to another, we have negative electrons produced here and positive here. Whenever you put in the center, that's where we would see the current. Now with photovoltaics, we'd have a small panel that does this, right? Again, remember they kind of work like they're like an Oreo cookie in a sense, that electrons are going from the top of the cookie to the bottom of the cookie because the frosting's in the way. The electrons can't go through the frosting, they have to go kind of around. And that's what generates the current. But we can actually link these together very easily. So we can kind of wire the top surfaces together, and we can have a solar array that's many, many, many different individual solar cells, which actually allows us to scale this thing up really easily, right? So we can just keep going and going and going, adding more and more and more solar cells to our solar array, meaning the solar can be scaled from, famously, you can put them on your roof, to you could install them over kind of a large area. And that's, one of the things that we're going to look at here. So the basics of photovoltaic, this technology was really kind of invented in the 1940s, And it's actually, especially in the 1940s, it was incredibly expensive to build these types of semiconductors in the context of photovoltaic. But that's something that we started to see change quite a bit. So initially, their biggest problem is cost. But one of their biggest benefits is that they're scalable, right? So if you have a camper, right? So you go out with your camper, you can go to Harbor Freight, buy yourself 2 small little photovoltaic panels, and you can charge up a car battery pretty easy, actually. And then you can use that car battery to power, the internal, lights and switches in your camper. Or, here on the CWI campus, you can go out to the bus station or the bus stop, and you can see that there's 2 small photovoltaic cells. And those generate enough power to charge a small battery that then powers the lights in the place itself. And we see these, we use these all over the place. So for research stations, right, if you want to have an outpost of, a data logger up near Bogus Basin, you're going to put in a small solar cell and a battery to keep that thing running all the time. So it's really, really useful. I'm trying to think of a couple more applications for pumps in agricultural applications. If you need power to your pump, you can install a small solar panel that will generate enough electricity to run your pump. Those traffic signs that tell you how quickly you're going, right? They need a small battery and a power source. And in the old days, we would have had to bury conduit and run power from the grid to those, and that's way too expensive. Now we can just put in a small photovoltaic cell, charge a small battery, and from that battery, run that over the course of the night. So they're really useful, and one of their main benefits is they're so scalable, right? They can generate small amounts of electricity to allow us to do a small thing, like a data logger or a traffic station or traffic camera. Or, like I said, we can hook a bunch of them together and generate significant amounts of energy. So locally, Idaho Power's been kind of getting invested into large kind of array solar enough where you're actually generating power to offset power generated in other ways. So you can see here, this is a solar farm just south of the Boise Airport, kind of, I guess, off Cunamora Road. A pretty out-of-the-way part of our neck of the woods here, so many people wouldn't even notice it. But if you were to drive from Boise to Mountain Home recently, also next to the freeway, you'll see that there's a brand new, kind of very large solar installation out there. At risk of talking about it too much, I've mentioned working in Sardinia for 10 years. They also, when you're out in the kind of corners of the island, the less inhabited places, often there's a huge solar field, hundreds of acres of solar because they generate power where they can. So again, this is a scalable thing, right? So you can see here, this would be a small installation that could generate enough power to use, for a small office or something like that. So you could kind of develop a private power system. Another thing that this is really attractive for is here you can see this is kind of a medium scale installation, and there are a lot of people who are in agriculture and they own swaths of land that they would typically grow soybeans or corn or something like that. In many cases, farmers are actually switching over to really just farm the sun rather than farming their crops. So you can see here, this is a place where a farmer put in solar panels rather than an agricultural field, and you don't have to go out and plant seeds, right? This thing just generates power, although again, that's not true over the course of the year. So these things can be large, right? And you can see here, this is a screen capture from Google Earth, right? These are, in the same neighborhood where we see some of these heliostat plants, we can also see massive swaths of photovoltaic. They have some of the same problems as we talked about with heliostat, and the fact that they are collecting that energy, and that energy is not going to the land surface, so they can change those microclimates for those critters who live there. That's a pretty small worry, although it is a worry nonetheless. There are certain types of tortoises and things like that that rely on that heat. But another thing, which also has similar implications, is we can actually install these in the ocean, right? We can actually install just these massive barges of floating solar photovoltaic like you see here. And in this case, you're not limited as much financially for the amount of space that you can take up. You can just keep hooking these things together and hooking these things together and hooking these things together and generate larger and larger and larger and larger and larger amounts of power. So it's pretty cool. Again, there's a big push, and we've seen a significant increase in people that are installing these personally, right? I think there's a famous, maybe not so famous, but kind of a well-known story in one of your readings where they are grappling with this in Hawaii, right? So Hawaii generates a lot of their energy by oil, right? They ship, because they're an isolated island, so they ship oil out there, they burn it in generators. It is really expensive power, so most people are opting to actually just pay upfront the cost of the photovoltaics, put 15 of them up on their roof, rather than pay the power bill, which is using the oil. And then the added benefit is that in many cases, either because you're generating power that then goes onto the grid and pulling power off of the grid when you need it, oftentimes you just don't get a power bill. That's kind of the more modern setup. You just don't get charged for usage. In previous times, and again, I think a lot of people are still grandfathered into this, if you're generating more and putting more on the grid than you're using, you actually get a check. I believe that they've kind of started to crack down on that in the sense that utility companies don't want to be shelling out so much money to each individual user. So the newer contracts are no power bill. Some of the older contracts, and you might even be able to negotiate, you would actually get paid for the power that you generate.